So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now finishing the workshop with the very last session with Professor Mark Stern. Mark Stern is the Kenneth L Professor of Social Policy and History at the University of Pennsylvania. Since 1994, he and Susan Seifert have headed Penn's Social Impact of Arts project. And this is the connection with the MAPSI project, as you will see, which develops methods for studying the role of the arts and culture in urban neighborhoods. I'll continue reading. In addition to SIAP, Stern's scholarship has focused on USA, social history, and social welfare policy. His most recent books include One Nation Divisible, What America Was and What Is Becoming, co-authored with Michael Katz, and Engaging Social Welfare, an introduction to policy analysis. So we are very pleased to welcome Professor Mark Stern. As you can see, the topic is very much related to the main focus of MAPSI, and we are very pleased to have you here. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Beatrice. Good afternoon. Very often I teach a 9 o'clock course at the University of Pennsylvania, and we end up with very few students clustered in the back. So could I ask people in the back to move up a little bit so that we have a closer feeling? All right, I'm not going to make anyone, but... Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's understandable. All right, so as Beatrice mentioned, Susan Seifert, who's here with us, and I've been running the Social Impact of the Arts project actually since 1994, which is getting to a point where I'm going to start saying before some of you were born, but not quite yet, I hope. And what I'd like to do today, essentially, is just give a brief introduction to the Social Impact of the Arts project, talk about two key concepts that drive our work: the idea of cultural ecology, or a cultural ecosystem, and the idea of social well-being, as we've conceptualized it in our work. And then I want to turn to specifically the work that we're right in the middle of. We started this project in New York City in January 2015. We hope to finish by the end of 2016, but we're very much in the middle of the project, so I will tell you about that and some of the findings that are coming out with that. And then I want to end with a point that maybe is more specific to the United States, which is essentially the threats to culture in poor and low-income neighborhoods in American cities and the implications of that. Okay, so some background on Social Impact of the Arts project. We started in 1994 with essentially the goal of developing methods and data for studying the way that the arts impacts urban neighborhoods. We've been very fortunate to be funded most of the time over the past 22 years. Most of our work has focused on the city of Philadelphia, where the University of Pennsylvania is. So we've been doing that more or less continuously for 20 years. We've done shorter projects in a number of American cities: Baltimore, Seattle, even shorter time in Austin. But then in 2014, the new Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, I don't know if people know, but in 2014, well, 2013, I guess, New York City elected a new mayor, de Blasio, who's considered in the American spectrum of politics to be quite a radical politician. And he has put reducing social and economic inequality, and especially spatial inequalities, at the center of his agenda for his term as mayor. So his cultural affairs commissioner, who we already knew, invited us to come into New York and do a similar study in that city. Now, I will say our first reaction to that was no way, because it's taken us 20 years to do Philadelphia, which only has 1.5 million people. So if you do the math, it turns out that I'd be something like 90 by the time we finished New York. But there's this phrase as in a New York minute, which means to do something very quickly. So we had a New York minute to do this study in New York. The research team, as I mentioned, is Susan Seifert and me from the University of Pennsylvania. And we work with a community development financial institution in Philadelphia, the Reinvestment Fund. They essentially are a nonprofit bank that funds community development projects in the city. So that has provided kind of an anchoring for us in terms of practice around community development. That's been very helpful as we've done the project. Throughout this, I guess it took us a while to develop it, but when we talk about cultural resources, we're essentially focused on these 4 types of resources. Nonprofit cultural organizations, which are very central to the cultural sector in the United States. For-profit cultural companies that can range from a gallery to a bookstore to an arts and crafts shop in the neighborhood or a music store in the neighborhood. And what those look like, where artists live in the city, resident artists, and finally where cultural participants live and where they aggregate in the city. I should point out on this slide, one thing we did with the Reinvestment Fund was we developed an online tool called Culture Blocks that allows us to put our data up on the web and portray it against other kinds of social data, and that's what this slide here shows. We then put those 4 indexes together to develop a single index of cultural assets. And we do this, I should mention, at a very small geography. In the United States, we call it a block group. So it's about 6 to 8 city blocks. So we want a separate estimate of the cultural assets for each. In Philadelphia, that's about 1,200 block groups. In New York, it's like 6,000. So in some ways, it's a nightmare. Why are we motivated to do this? We actually got into this work because during the 1990s, there was a concerted attack on the cultural sector, particularly on nonprofit culture, around the issue of controversial arts. These four sterling artists were called the NEA 4 because in the 1990, the presidentially appointed head of the National Endowment for the Arts essentially pulled their grant because they thought they were too controversial. So this issue of controversial arts and how the public should be involved in the funding of arts became a very central issue during the 1990s. This public purpose in the arts was a response to that, and I think it got us thinking about why the arts matter. In addition to working on social impact of the arts project, Susan is a city planner. I teach in a school of social work. So issues around social inequality have been very central to our work throughout our careers. And as Beatrice mentioned, we also published this book, One Nation Divisible, during 2006. So again, this issue of inequality has always very much driven our work. Okay, so in a certain way, when we say social impact of the arts, one way to think about what we do is what we don't do. And very much we came to the idea, I should say in all humility, this was Susan's idea, that we should define the idea that the economic impact of arts was dominating discussions of arts policy during the 1990s. You had to prove that you mattered economically. And we sat around the table one night, we're married, I should mention, we said, really, that's not why the arts matter. The arts matter for reasons other than their economic impact. And what would a study of that look like? That was a really good question. The answer to it took a number of years to work out. But in any event, really as a starting point, we said we weren't going to look at the economic impact of the art. And as I say here, in a certain way, many of those economic impact studies, they're really about producing a really big number. And that's what matters. And it turns out that, big numbers are all relative. So on the one hand, it turned out that, for the economists, of course, know this, that there's this issue of substitution effect. If you go to Bilbao to see the museums, then you're not going to go to a museum in your town. So economic impact is sort of like a shell game to that extent. More importantly, in terms of what we thought about, was that what happens if gambling has a bigger economic impact in the arts? Or in a relevant for Philadelphia, what if scrap metal? I don't know, scrap metal, I don't know if that translates. That's like if you find old cars around and you crush them up. We have a very large scrap metal thing right by the Philadelphia airport, so it's an excellent, when you come to Philadelphia, the first thing you see when you come over the bridge is them crushing used cars. So it's a nice metaphor. But suppose that produces more economic impact than the arts. Then what do we say? That people should be investing in scrap metal instead of the arts? So this has come up a number of times during the discussion, but we've always said that you need different yardsticks to measure the social impact of the arts, and the problem is they don't exist. So that's really what the social impact of the arts project has been around. I'm going to go over that, but essentially, for every Bilbao, there's like too many poor little towns that decided they're going to become an economic mecca. I once did a project looking at Duluth, Minnesota, and various other places, all of whom thought they were going to be like the next Bilbao, except they never got the Guggenheim. So anyway, there's a problem there. The other group the other ideas that in some ways we defined ourselves against are Richard Florida's idea of the creative class. Do people know this work? Or is this not something that Europeans talk about?
We know it.
You know it a little bit. So anyway, it's sort of this idea that the creatives are what matter. And this came up yesterday in one session, but there's this issue that if we're going, first of all, the creatives, especially when you define it the way Florida did to include corporate lawyers and managers, it's not exactly a needy group. So the idea that you're going to steer resources to benefit this particular group, poses a number of problems and has led to a variety of silly things like this idea of creating a gay district as a way of putting a town on the class. The most important point for us has been this idea that at its core, it's about steering resources towards a group that's already quite privileged in terms of society. So our goal has been to move beyond center cities, to look at the role of arts and culture in urban neighborhoods, in places where tourists don't go, where they don't spend their dollars, but where arts and culture play a key role in terms of how a community defines itself, how people interact with each other, and how they think about their role, their place in the world. So it's interesting. I don't know, do people know this New Yorker cover? It's quite famous in the U.S. It's like a New Yorker's view of the U.S. So they're like looking out and they sort of see San Francisco and then Japan, but there's like a lot of empty space in between. In reality, in terms of our project in New York, we should have turned this around 180 degrees, because what we're about is what's going on is sort of a Manhattan person's view of New York. So that where's the Bronx, where's Queens, where's Brooklyn to some extent, and where's Staten Island. So this idea of moving beyond, looking at the role, how arts resources aggregate in particular urban neighborhoods, and the impact of those agglomerations on the well-being of people has been very central to our work. So as I said, there are these two ideas that have really driven us. One is this notion of cultural ecology. What we find in much of the arts research in the United States is people see individuals, they say individual organizations, but they don't think about how those different organizations and individuals come together in particular places. So this idea about the interaction between a set of cultural resources, and specifically the geography of culture, and how that makes a difference in two ways. First of all, it makes a difference within the cultural world, because artists want to be near art supplies and other artists, and they need to have the places where they can aggregate. So there's a literature on the role of clusters, economic clusters, as a way of increasing productivity, and there's some literature on that in terms of the cultural sector. More importantly, in terms of our work, has been this notion of what sociologists call neighborhood effects. How having arts in a neighborhood has a spillover effect that changes the character of the neighborhood, and specifically how it changes indexes of social well-being in the neighborhood. So the concept we've used to kind of crystallize that notion of cultural ecology is this notion of natural cultural districts. So instead of city planners and economic development experts getting together and say, we're going to plop a cultural district down in this part of the city, what we're looking for is places where these cultural resources come together without planning, without some top-down planning process, but that they come together for their own reasons, and the way that aggregation of cultural resources makes a difference in people's neighborhood. And that's a map of Philadelphia with some of the cultural districts marked in it. Now, one of the problems we discovered in terms of looking at cultural districts and cultural resources is there's this very strong correlation between the presence of cultural resources in a neighborhood and its economic and locational advantages. If you're in a high-income neighborhood in the middle of the city, you're going to have many more resources than outside. And one of the things we've been interested in, because of our concern around inequality, is in a sense lower and middle income neighborhoods that in a sense are outperforming what we would expect given the economic and locational barriers they face. So I have them circled somewhere here. So they're neighborhoods that have, they may be far from center city, they may have high poverty rates, but given that they have more cultural resources than we would expect. And what do those neighborhoods look like? And we've come to this term of thinking of them as civic clusters. They're not really come into being because of a market logic, because they're high productivity. They're really coming together to serve a local neighborhood, and that's the logic behind their existence. So what we've discovered is these civic clusters, in terms of looking at issues around social well-being, are really central. They're the ones where you see the biggest impact of arts and culture on people's daily life. I'm going to skip, there's a couple of slides on kind of what we found through the years talking about natural cultural districts. Maybe just this last point, because it's an urban point. It's this notion that, Jane Jacobs, I don't know if people read her, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she makes this point that often diverse neighborhoods die not because they're failures, but because they're successes. That in a sense, success drives diversity out of a neighborhood. And I think we see this very often in terms of these natural cultural districts we're looking at, that they start off as kind of rough and tumble places, but then some person gets a bright idea that they could build luxury condominiums in the area, and then the entire character of the neighborhood changes. So we've been very interested in these neighborhoods as what we're calling here these vulnerable habitats that in a sense need strategies to protect them or they get obliterated. This is in fact, I love these slides because this is one of our favorite natural cultural districts, what's called Chinatown North or Callow Hill, and it's an extremely ugly neighborhood. In fact, I wrote a blog once about natural cultural districts, and I put some slides from this neighborhood on it. And then when it ended up appearing on the website, the people who managed the websites took those slides out and put slides of much more attractive people and much more attractive places on it, because this, and I've had this over and over again, I've had students come back, I'll say, okay, go to this neighborhood, because this is a natural cultural district, tell me about it, and they'll come back and say, no, that was a really ugly place, why would you call that a natural cultural district? So we're contrary. All right, social well-being. As you know, as many of you know, I know some of you have studied it, that there's this split between what subjective and objective well-being, and each of them presents a number of methodological problems. In terms of our work, I mean, we actually thrashed around with this concept for the first 15 years in our existence, but we finally hooked onto this notion of the capabilities approach associated with Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. I don't know if people are familiar with this. I mean, we actually got it from Europeans, so I think of it as some colleagues of ours in Germany kind of encouraged us to use. But it's essentially more of an objective measure of well-being, focused on the assumption that what well-being is this opportunity to live a life that you have reason to value. It's a very simple concept. What a capability is essentially having that kind of opportunity. And then they have this notion around functioning about, once you have that choice, translating that choice into what you actually decide to do. So this has been very important in terms of our work. There's been a lot of international work from OECD and Eurostat on this. I should say this is like one of their rankings. Spain ended up 26, which isn't very good. The United States ended up 27. So you can feel good about that. Now, one of the problems I have is I hate these rankings. Honestly, I hate rankings of cities. I hate rankings of countries. I especially hate rankings of countries, because if you're a neighborhood person, if what you're interested in is what happens in a particular neighborhood, a country becomes an aggregation of tens of thousands of neighborhoods. You get and as you know, the statisticians know, you take an average of a highly differentiated population and you end up with a figure that doesn't necessarily tell you much. Oh, I got ahead of myself. Anyway, another contribution to this is the Sen-Stiglitz report that was commissioned by the French president, which essentially put out this multidisciplinary notion on these 8 dimensions of social welfare. Social well-being, ranging from material well-being down through insecurity, what have you. We actually decided to take this as our starting point in terms of thinking about how you would do this at the neighborhood level. And you know, the reason for that is because we see inequality as having a very profound geographic dimension. In the US, there's a very long literature on concentrated disadvantage and the impact that has to live in a neighborhood that is disadvantaged in a whole variety of ways. In addition, many of these measures of well-being don't really operate at the national level. They may be a product of sociability, of other bottom-up forces that if you try to measure at the national level, you're not going to do. So we just made this commitment to come up with a neighborhood level measure of well-being, which turns out maybe not to have been a smart decision, but we ended up with these. What happened was we started with the Sen-Stiglitz report with their 8 dimensions, and for some of the dimensions collapsed because it turned out that you couldn't differentiate educational attainment from income if you look at it at a small geographic level. Others split up so that they have a health benefit dimension, but we found 3 different dimensions of health that weren't necessarily correlated across the city. So we ended up with 13 dimensions. Another innovation we made in terms of this audience, I hope I didn't leave it off. Did I? I left it off. Oops. Was that we included the cultural asset index as one of the dimensions of social well-being. So I used to have a different slide of this, which I really thought was a beautiful slide, but no one could read it. So I redid it for this presentation, of course, made a mistake. And finally, there's this issue of how, once you have multiple dimensions, what you can say is, how do those different dimensions come come together? Do you find neighborhoods that are like bad, 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 others that are good, 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 and then some neighborhoods in between that may have certain strengths and other weaknesses? We're particularly interested in those mixed neighborhoods because those strengths may provide a hook for the standpoint of intervening in the neighborhoods to improve the quality of life. So if you've got a neighborhood that has terrible economic status but has very strong social connections, you may be able to use those social connections as a lever for bringing about change. So anyway, that was the map of what it looked like in Philadelphia. I'm not doing Philadelphia geography, so. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're doing this in New York against my better judgment. So far, we're in the middle of it. We're going to do the 4 dimensions, but we haven't done the third one yet. So we've only done nonprofit, for-profit, and artists. And I just wanted to show you what that looks like. So far we've found 4,000 nonprofit entities. I should mention that we have to create all of these data sets. The common story, if you went into knowledgeable people in the city of New York, was that New York had 1,200 arts nonprofits. So far we've found 4,500. So you need to look under rocks. Well, that's a metaphor. To find these, so we go through all sorts of different data sets. We scan the web looking for evidence that places exist. So let me, just for a second, people know Manhattan, the skinny island. That's if you've ever been to New York, that's probably where you spend most of your time. If you go anywhere else, it's probably Brooklyn. It used to be no one went to Brooklyn. But now is that King Kong cartoon I had up earlier. Did people see that? Manhattan is so over, I should have pointed it. But now people go to Brooklyn because there are cool neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Now, my daughter lives in Brooklyn. She's cool. But then there's the whole rest of the city. There's Queens, a vast agglomeration of immigrant neighborhoods and more middle-class home-owning neighborhoods. The Bronx, which has one of the most concentrated poverty in the entire city, and Staten Island, which is really kind of a suburban home-owning community. So New York's got a lot more diversity than most people will encounter just in a day or two. And you can see, as you would expect, there's this huge concentration of nonprofits in the city of New York. And this is what it looks like if we try to map it in a way that's more coherent. You can see those brown areas are the big concentrations down to the green areas, which are not so, have very few resources. But notice that there are brown areas outside of Manhattan, and they're sort of scattered around. So again, we're contrary to established wisdom, so we're looking for these neighborhoods where things are going on that people don't expect. For-profit cultural resources, we found 17,000 of those. New York's different because obviously it's the center for many national and international industries, which is different from Philadelphia, which doesn't have that distinction. Their profile, however, looks quite similar to that of nonprofits, a little more concentrated in Manhattan than outside. And finally, artists are even more scattered across the city, as you might expect. Rent is a relevant thing for artists, so they tend to want to stay on the train longer. I could talk about what a headache it is to make estimates of artists in New York, but the hour's late. So we put all those together to come up with a cultural asset index, which shows us in the city where the strongest concentration of all those cultural resources are. Now in New York, as we found in Philadelphia, there's this very strong concentration, our correlation between economics and locational advantages and the presence of the cultural asset index. And I've highlighted, so you've got neighborhoods up here that are like the famous neighborhoods, like Village and places where everyone's expecting there to be a lot of culture. At this end, I put the names on these civic clusters, these neighborhoods that have economic or locational challenges, but still have more cultural resources than we would expect. And then what we do then is we translate that into what we call a corrected cultural asset index, where we correct for the economic and the locational problems through regression analysis. So these are groups that end up with a high score because they move up because they have so many challenges. And then there's some neighborhoods that are quite well off that move down because they're so well off that they should have more resources than they do. And then we, again, do that into the same idea of different types of natural cultural districts within the city. Okay, let me talk a little bit about social well-being. Essentially, again, we're dealing with a situation where the data exists, but it doesn't exist in the form we want it in. So again, we don't look under rocks for this data, but we look around government bureaucracies to find data sources that'll allow us to measure this. So economic well-being is income, educational attainment, and labor force participation. That's what it looks like across New York City. Another measure is, this is like, New York City is a horrible place in terms of paying rent. Because I guess it's because it's a desirable city, so it's horrible from a renter standpoint. This is the proportion of people who spend over half of their household income on rent. So a very high proportion. And we combine that with a variety of other indexes to come up with neighborhoods where we see this really high housing burden in terms of neighborhoods. And then there are other neighborhoods that, these green ones, that have much lower burden in terms of housing. Social stress is a concept we picked up from some other researchers at Penn. It's essentially looking at teen births, reported cases of child abuse and neglect, and birth outcomes, low birth, I don't know if people know this stuff, low birth weight, APGAR scores, I shouldn't get into this, but essentially a variety of measures of the kind of overall health, particularly the health of neighborhoods that face particular economic challenges. And you can see these two really strong areas, one in the Bronx and one actually in Brooklyn, where there's this very high concentration on this measure. School effectiveness, we look at test scores and evidence on school environment to find neighborhoods that are in which the schools are doing quite well. And then this is a big issue in the US. I don't know if it's an issue here because schools are all locally funded, there's this huge variation in terms of school quality. Personal health is another measure. This is actually self-reported evidence on fair and poor health. We put that together with this is morbidity. This is a measure where we put together a variety of measures of things like diabetes, people know obesity, a variety of other things, to look at kind of where in the city people have really terrible health and good health. I put this slide in just to wake people up. We have an environment measures, which allows us to go into satellite photos. This is a satellite photo of a really hot day in New York. Because I don't know if this is an issue, well, I don't know if probably not much of an issue in Bilbao, but in the US, people drop dead during heat waves. There's a famous study of Chicago on the risks of this. So we have this measure of like heat indexes in the city, and we combine it with other data on where there are trees, where the grass is, and how that influences a neighborhood. So we take all these measures together. There are a few we haven't yet fully estimated, and then we do again that analysis around concentrations of advantages and disadvantages. And in New York, we found these 4 categories. In addition to the 2 extremes, we have what we're calling these green and comfortable neighborhoods with relatively high income and lots of trees, and what we call these diverse and struggling neighborhoods. Really terrible economic outcomes, are pretty bad, but it's interesting because they're neighborhoods that economically they're not in good shape at all, but they don't have high morbidity, they don't have high social stress, so they do quite well on some of the health measures. They tend to be high immigrant neighborhoods, so they tend to come across as ethnically and economically diverse. So that's pretty interesting. All right, so the final part of this study, of the New York study, is to say, okay, we've measured culture, we've measured social well-being. What's the connection? Where can we, and so what we, and again, these are preliminary, everything I've said for the last 15 minutes is a preliminary analysis, but this one's really preliminary. But essentially, what we do is use regression analysis to look at the connection between the presence of cultural resources to social well-being corrected for income, race, and ethnicity. So that's sort of the basic model. And then where could we possibly find that kind of connection? And these are kind of the 4 dimensions of social well-being where we feel like you could make a plausible case that having arts, it's hard to make the case that if you have arts in a neighborhood, like, it's not as hot. In fact, it turns out that high arts neighborhoods have like worse environments than low arts neighborhoods. I don't know why that is. But anyway, there are certain connections you just couldn't plausibly say the arts and culture are influencing those. So these are 4 dimensions where we think you could plausibly see some sort of connection between the two. And again, we do this regression analysis, correcting for income, ethnicity, and race. And we also found that there was an interaction effect between that low-income neighborhoods, that is the bottom 40% of the income distribution in terms of these neighborhoods, operate quite differently from the middle and upper income neighborhoods. So we split the file to look at those. And what we discover, maybe I'm going to, because I'm going on too long, let me put it this way, both in terms of social stress, insecurity, which is around crime essentially, and school effectiveness, what we find is not a very consistent relationship in high and middle income neighborhoods, but a very consistent relationship in low income neighborhoods, which brings me to kind of the core contradiction of our work in New York, which is that although low income neighborhoods have fewer cultural resources, those resources make a bigger difference in terms of social well-being in those neighborhoods. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that. If you're in a high-income neighborhood, you've got all sorts of, the educational attainment or the schools are going to be quite good, whether you have arts or not. In low-income neighborhoods, having a set of additional cultural resources to make up for the fact that you don't have income, you don't have a highly educated population makes a difference. So this notion that arts make a difference in low-income neighborhoods, even though they have fewer resources, has really been at the core of our work. I'm not going to go into this one, except to make the point that part of this is also tamping down expectations. That is to say, if you talk to certain people in the arts world, arts are like a magic wand, or US, we are big on guns, so we say silver bullets. But it's, that the arts, all you have to do is do an arts project in a low-income neighborhood, and suddenly everyone is happy and rich. So at the same time, we want to make the case that there is this connection. We also want to say to the arts world that you can't go around saying all you need are arts and life is great. So it works both ways. So essentially what we're finding are modest effects in terms of how the arts are associated with these other dimensions of well-being. They are consistent, statistically significant effects, but they're not the world changing in these neighborhoods. The final point is around, I'm really going over, so what's going on in low-income neighborhoods. I've already talked about this correlation between income inequality and the presence of cultural resources. In Philadelphia, we've been doing this work long enough we can look at change over time. What we found is this relationship between income and cultural resources doubled between the late 90s and the early 2000 teens. So we're moving in the wrong direction. If we think of that as not a good thing, we're moving in the wrong direction. I showed you a map earlier of the natural cultural districts in Philadelphia. This is what happened between 97 and 2011. All of these gray areas, I can't really point, out here in West Philly and up here in North Philly, those are the lowest, those are the highest poverty African American and Latino neighborhoods. And in 97, they had cultural clusters. And by and large, by 2011, they had lost many of them. And then finally, the same way what we've discovered is this very high mortality rate among nonprofit organizations in those neighborhoods. So they were there in '97, they're not there anymore. And in looking at what might have caused that, one of the things we discovered was that philanthropic funding is highly tilted towards well-off neighborhoods. This is getting data in the United States, most of the funding for nonprofit arts and culture comes from the private sector, from individuals, but mostly from foundations, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, groups like this. If we take all of that funding and say, where is it being given out? What we came up with was that out of all of the funding, 1% ended up in these concentrated disadvantaged neighborhood, and another 2% ended up in these mixed neighborhoods. So essentially, the foundations are essentially investing in the status quo, which is a status quo that's highly tilted against low-income neighborhoods. So this is where I end up, which is essentially, we've demonstrated the arts have a consistent impact on neighborhoods. But if you want to have that impact, you have to be willing to make the investments. And that's something we'd like to see people do more. Thanks.
So, thank you very much, Professor Stein, for this lecture. Is there any? I would like to open the floor for questions or comments on this. I have a comment. You develop, well, as far as I see that you support the hypothesis that geography matters.
Yes.
That's the main affirmation. So you develop this concept of natural cultural districts, which is the concept coined in this presentation, which are non-public, money-driven.
By and large.
By and large. So they are not public policy-driven, natural cultural districts. Okay. So from the theoretical point of view, there's a huge debate on this in economic geography. Because Michael Porter said that who cluster? The ones who cluster are the equal ones. So you have the musicians clustering geography, writers clustering geography, then you have the video games clustering geography, so the same clustered geography. And this is Michael Porter's position. Then we have Jane Jacobs. And Jane, as you already mentioned, and Jane Jacobs says, no, this is not correct. The positive externalities of clustering don't come from equals, but come from different. By diversity. To the extent there are diverse artists, even not artists, like knowledge-intensive business service professionals. Many times, knowledge-intensive business services, they live in these areas, some of them. This is why the process gets into some sort of gentrification, because you have these knowledge-intensive business services moving there at the second stage, okay? So the positive externalities comes from diversity. And there is exchange of knowledge, there's exchange of experiences, and as a result of this change, there is an increase of productivity or well-being, let's say, and as a result of positive externalities. Okay.
Right.
And I would move one step forward.
Okay.
At the end, we are talking about connectivity. Yes, and I'll give an example. There is a theater called Teatro del Lago in a town at the very south of Chile, in the middle of nowhere. And it is very successful. There's no agglomeration economies. It's not New York, it's not Philadelphia either, because it's Chile. Right. It's not Santiago, Chile. And it is at the very south, close to the Patagonia. Okay? And which is the key? Which is the business model in this case? The business model in this case is there's no agglomeration economies, there is no cluster between equals, no clustering between diverse, but the key issue is that the director, he is German, and he was the former director of the Berlin Orchestra. So he is very well connected. So he is the director of the orchestra, and he makes direct connections within one path to Berlin. And he organizes the very best music concerts in Chile. Mm-hmm. So although accessibility is close to zero, the people that really appreciate these concerts, they are willing to go there. So we also have the concept of willingness to travel, no? To assume the distance course according to. So we have this thing of business model. So you have some business model when you have agglomeration economies, but then you have totally different business models where you don't have agglomeration economies.
Well, go ahead, finish.
No, it's okay. So what I mean is that here, I know that in these cases of the neighborhoods, their main aim is not market. But somehow there has to be two things. One is what type of connectivity do you have? Is it the more cluster-oriented connectivity, or is it the diverse-oriented connectivity, or is it a connectivity from the network analysis, like in the Teatro del Lago? There has to be some sort of connectivity that is linked to a business model, because each business model is run by a sort of connectivity.
You raise a really good point, and I mean, we tend to see these neighborhoods as really one geographically defined social network. And we actually have ambitions to do other kinds of network analysis, but they're a lot harder. I'll say that to them. We actually did one study. We were studying a particular program in Philadelphia, and we were able to really look at who was talking to who among community arts groups. And we came up with and where their audience is coming from. We came up with this notion of what we called the regional audience for community art. Mm-hmm. So that we found that there were arts centers in like the poorest sections of town, but people were pulling people from all across the region to come there. So I mean, I totally agree with you that I think as I said, we're trying to come up with concepts. We're trying to come up with methods. The methods around the geographic networks have been easier for us to conceptualize and measure. But I don't see I wouldn't say that's the only that all these other kind of networks don't matter. Sue, did you want to say something on that?
Okay. I guess I would say. I guess I think if we go back to the cultural ecology, that's the overarching framework, okay? So the natural cultural district as a neighborhood is not an autonomous district. It's still part of a city region, mm-hmm. really region, okay? So that all of your models, so we usually we start with this, what you're seeing, the geographic and statistical analysis, and really the data. We'd have to develop the data and the statistical analysis. The next phase, and what we'll be doing in New York, is qualitative work. So we take a set of, this is the broad, shallow relationship understanding of the city and region. Then we take a set of neighborhoods and go deep, and we'll do go deep and interview and observe and validate and all of that. And we're going to find at least one of every example you gave, okay, among our neighborhoods, every example you gave. So we'll find, we won't find the connection to Berlin, mm-hmm. but we will find the neighborhoods. the network, so the concept really is a neighborhood-based cultural ecosystem, so that every city has a set of these natural cultural districts. Some are more market-driven, or what we call high market, which is they're exceeding their expectations at the other end. And they're interdependent, so that the civic clusters are connected to the market clusters, okay? And their audience is the fourth piece that we haven't done yet, is participation. So in New York, our next stage is the participation data to add to the index and the qualitative case study work. That's why we don't think we can do it in we need more than 1 year. But once you see participation, you see the cross-neighborhood net connections. And it's not Berlin, but there might be a facility that's a generator. And frankly, if we went to your South Santiago equivalent in New York, there's going to be something we'll find about that facility. There's going to be artists connected, projects connected. There's going to be little satellite. There's going to be clubs or music groups. There are going to be all kinds of things. It's not really just going to be one big organization. You're going to see a lot of things around it that you didn't have the data on. You'll find it when you go into the neighborhood, and then you interview people and ask them how they connect, blah, blah, blah. And we think this is the first time we're going to ask people, can you account for a better health outcome in your neighborhood? We haven't moved to the qualitative side of social well-being yet. We've asked people more about the cultural ecology. So this is a new stage for the qualitative work. But all the models, and also that's the ecological thing. It's the a biodiversity, okay? So a homogeneous Michael Porter type cultural neighborhood where you have one type is a little more vulnerable. We actually have tried to do this in Philadelphia, whereas a heterogeneous or a more diverse neighborhood has more stability or more sustainability, just like a biological model almost, that the cultural and cultural diversity fosters sustainability, especially, but you need the external network or you'll die. Yeah.
I should mention, just as Sue was talking, that like everything we write, we put up on the web. So we have this website, and as I said, we've been doing this for 22 years. So there's a few studies up there.
Yes, and in connection with this connectivity, what I have learned somehow, if I'm not right, please correct me, that also in low-income neighborhoods, they appreciate culture, but there seems to be some sort of like a time bank in which they exchange for free as they are low income. So perhaps there is this notion of Jane Jacobs, where you have very different subsectors, and they are always exchanging for free and creating a special voluntary market, civil cluster, what you call civil cluster. Mm-hmm. So somehow there is a value because they are supplying the services, but they are exchanging it like in a time bank. Selling time of a cultural service, buying time, and inputs, selling and buying. This is my feeling. And this is why it is sustainable, although it is a low-income neighborhood, because they really love culture, like high-income neighborhoods as well. So it will be interesting to analyze which are the market or non-profit-driven mechanisms that support this type of geographical concentration of these subsectors. I just find it fascinating to find the logic of it. Because it's not a typical high agglomeration economies driven cultural sectors like big museums or big theaters. No, it's absolutely a different logic.
Yeah.
So
and sometimes people do things for reasons other than their economic benefit. So I think, another way of saying that is that artists are crazy, but that's a less popular way to make the point.
Sorry, do you have any indicator in New York about neighborhood pride? The pride of being part of the pride, yes, the pride of being part of neighborhood. Because maybe in the lowest income neighborhoods, the pride is higher. So probably this is related with the
identity.
The identity and the natural cultural activities or natural cultural resources, I don't know. Maybe the pride.
It's interesting, in Philadelphia we had measures of things like how much people trusted their neighbors, how much did they feel like they belonged in their neighborhood, how engaged were they in neighborhood activities. We haven't gotten those in New York. I will say one of the things I've come away from today with is that we probably should be snooping around the web to see if there's some sorts of big data out there, or some way of looking at the kinds of things people are doing, are surfing in neighborhoods to see if it could indicate. I think in terms of if you, I don't talk causality, as you probably have already noticed. If I were forced to draw a causal diagram, there'd be something in between the arts and those social well-beings, and it is something of, I refer to it as an X factor. It's just something where you go into these neighborhoods that have high concentrations of arts and culture, and they're different. Mm-hmm. There is a feeling in the neighborhood. There's a feeling that something's going on. So there is something there too that we haven't measured yet. Well, there's 1,000 things on these neighborhoods we haven't measured yet, and I think that's one of them.
Please.
We have been doing some research on subjective well-being, always at the individual level, and there are a couple of things that we have learned, and one of these are measures of social capital, a la Putman, very conventional. But the fact that there are like two very important dimensions, the bridging one and the bonding. And probably when thinking about districts, the endowment of one type or the other is important, right? Yeah. Like this trust and relationships with your peers or with absolutely different people. And what we have learned about this is that they have an effect, a mediator effect. For instance, in terms of how exposed you can be to peer effects. We have done this with comparison income, right? So income and what's the effect of the income of the others over your financial satisfaction. And at the individual level, this matters. And this matters in different ways. And this matters in a non-linear way, such that for some, we have done this with individual observations in different countries, and for instance in Latin America, there are some effects for which having richer ones in your community are like good news. They are the good news that you could do as good as them, whereas for others it is just a negative externality, feeling poorer. So probably for this sort of analysis, even if you are not going to enter into causality, which is reasonable at this level, creating, like taking into account measures of social capital, and probably, these measures of trust, belonging to different associations, and just dividing the bridging and the bonding one is like a good hint in order to try to grab what's there. And then my question was that, of course, have you considered the possibility in order to, at least in some of these districts, to get individual level observations, like to say, okay, we use happiness measures of happiness, of subjective well-being, of these sort of things. Is this in your working plan, or this should be like in the next generation of these sort of studies?
It should be, because obviously we're making an argument about neighborhood effects, but in a certain way you can't really totally prove that argument unless you also say to what extent are there individual effects. I know, and that's that would be desirable. We did that we did that a while ago with the study with cultural participation, because we were able to use, at one point the Survey of Public Participation in the Arts had a restricted file where they had zip code data attached, so you were able to attach ecological data. And we were able to show that the ecological effect was actually stronger than some of the individual effects that have been so important in terms of that debate. You know, from a aesthetic effect in terms of study design, it would be desirable to have both kinds of data. I think time's running out on me, so I'm hoping someone else. But you know, I agree with you. Yeah.
When considering things.
Yeah, I think that's
personal and then institutional and community.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know we've talked to the people at the NEA around the fact that they should bring back the capacity to look at the ecology, because we think the studies tend to be flawed because they don't consider that. It's impossible to use those files to consider that. But it would be desirable, not just in terms of participation, but in terms of all these measures.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting as a counterexample, because normally the cultural creative industries are concentrated in high productivity areas with high levels of innovation and R&D investment, high connectivity, high agglomeration economies, and normally you don't have case studies in academic literature of this type. So I find it very interesting case studies. Very interesting case studies could be developed in connection with this focus, and perhaps, as Vicky mentioned, with individual data, we could use network analysis to see which are the patterns. And so it will be the other side of the coin. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it is absolutely against the mainstream in economic theory, and especially in economic geography. So I think it was really interesting to get into this analysis and to see really which are the real dynamics that make this civic cluster work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's easier to make, I don't know if economic theory is the best way to make sense of them. I do think probably sociological theories are more direct. And as I made a joke before, but you know, as Sue said, we go out and do these case studies, and the way economic rationales come up is basically we can't raise enough money and we can't pay our people. But it doesn't come up that the reason we're doing this work is to maximize productivity or maximize profit or maximize anything. Mm-hmm. So it, you know, it's there's a lot there to explain. Yeah. You know, and as you can see from my I'm an historian, so historians are incredibly sloppy. My friend Michael Katz, who I wrote 2 books with, said that the reason historians are good policy analysts is because they're used to drawing broad conclusions from fragmentary data. You know, medieval historians come up with total theories of a millennium of European history based on a handful of documents. We have now, contemporary historians have the opposite problem. There's like too much garbage out there to look at. But the point is that I think the reason I've been so comfortable doing this kind of work is because the data is a disaster. It's a very important topic, and I'm used to working in messy playground, sand pit, or what is it, like sandboxes, I guess we'd say.
Okay. So, yes, please.
Right. economists, we have been reading books such as The Triumph of the City, right? You put Florida, we read Florida, but also The Triumph of the City. And there is a strand also in cultural economics, like Bruno Frey, thinking about how cities may make people happy or not, right? So even in economic geography, the happiness research and this sort of data are getting published. Like, okay, what's the effect of the size of the habitat? Is this agglomeration making people happy? Not. Does it depend on the level of education? And I would like to ask you, from the mapping or from the different dimensions that you have been studying, do you have like a flavor or a personal view of the evidence? Do cities make people happy? Or under which conditions? Well,
I'm messy, but I'm not insane. No, I don't know. Susan's saying, so shall I answer the question?
I've learned a lot by working with Mark. So one thing I learned was, he said, don't ask people what they think or what they feel. Don't ask those subjective, all the questions you want to ask. He says, just watch what they do. So he just says behavior. Everything, ask people, what do they do? That's why we want to see who goes to events. We just say to the sign in, give us their address. Don't ask them if they liked it or didn't like it. They went. They walked through the door. Okay, that's something, okay? If they walk through the door 10 times, we go at a year. So the behavior measure, do people like cities or not? In the US, one thing we can say, when we started the research, early 90s, and tried to present that we were finding a lot of cultural we were still stuck on nonprofits. We didn't get that far yet. And we were finding them in what were called integrated neighborhoods, so racially, ethnically diverse, and then we also found these economically diverse. So you had professionals and very poor in the same neighborhood. We called them POV-PROF, or poverty and professional. So the people at the university were like, God, when will these people leave because they're idiots? And they said, you've got statistical error, you're looking at marginal neighborhoods, and the most polite people said those neighborhoods are in transition, gentrifying, that you've picked okay. Well, we kept finding culture associated with stable diversity. This is big in the US. I mean, everyone talks. We're supposed to be segregated. All the books say so. All the news says so. And we kept finding increasing diversity and culture self-locating, self-organized cultural groups are in these neighborhoods because they need it. Because the pride. It's partly it's the bonding and bridging, probably. And are people happy? I don't know if they're happy, but I think it's by their actions and behavior, not by asking if they're happy or not. People are choosing more coming into cities. It used to be only the people with no choice or risk takers or artists, would move into these neighborhoods. More and more people are moving in. They're voting with their feet. Are they happy? I don't know, but they're there. So, they're paying too much to live in an ugly place. So we say they're happy enough. They'll move out, or they'll stay, or they'll invest, or they'll do what they want. But we are seeing trends that are positive around urban living.
When we first found that, in '97 we did a study, and we said Philadelphia has more economically and ethnically diverse neighborhoods, twice as many today as it did a decade ago. And as Sue said, people thought we were totally nuts. Now, we've lived long enough that now what people thought we were crazy to say has become almost conventional wisdom, that cities are becoming more diverse, and it's the diverse neighborhoods that are driving cities. But the interesting thing for us was that if you looked at the city in other dimensions, these neighborhoods looked marginal, but if you looked at them from the standpoint of arts and culture, these diverse neighborhoods were at the core. So it's one of those perceptual things, like where's the center of the city? And if you look at it from an art standpoint, it's slightly different.
Last one.
Yes, please.
It's your conference, so you can.
Lots of people. Have you done some analysis of property values? Because this is hedonics, right? One of the way to measure non-market goods in economic theory is if you have the data, do some regressions, take into account that housing will account for that, right? So we'll account for cultural assets, good account for these intangible social and community aspects. So a hedonic analysis at this level with property prices probably is an alternative, very canonical from the economic point of view. Yeah. And if data are available and you're enriching your data at a very specific level. So probably, by the way, what could be the average size of each of these small boxes in terms of people? How many blocks of houses around?
So it'll be about a little over 1,000 people.
Right, so that's quite.
Yeah.
And
we have done, in the early 2000s, we did a number of studies because the reinvestment fund, our partner, is very interested in, like, they invest in low-income neighborhoods and they want to know if they improve. I don't know if you heard about it in Spain, but there was this housing bubble. Yes. In 26 to 7. I understand that there were a few places in Spain where that happened as well. So I've been a little, what the housing value graphs look like. They look like an earthquake. Literally, an earthquake happened at one point. So we haven't. The studies in the early, that made us question the studies we were doing in the early 2000s because we were just picking up the bubble effect. So we haven't done it recently. The flip side of that is, of course, as soon as you do a property value study around arts and culture, everyone just says gentrification. So when we do those again, which we have very good data, and we're actually doing, our partner, Ira Goldstein, we've been developing some measures of gentrification, both in terms of changes in property values compared to changes of people's income. And in terms, we can use some of the census data to we're measuring what we call churn. That is, can you find neighborhoods where people with a high school degree are moving out and people with a college degree are moving in, or in the US context where whites are moving in and African Americans and Latinos are moving out. So we're doing that, and I think we're going to have to fit I think we have to contextualize the property value thing in the context of how this is impacting mobility patterns in these neighborhoods. Because if you just do the property value, it's like a lose-lose. Like if you find a good impact, people say, "Oh, gentrification, arts are terrible." And, if you find no effect, they say the arts don't help anything. The arts are terrible. So you have to do a slightly broader framework.
Any more questions? So thank you very much, Mark and Susan, for this presentation and the discussion. And hopefully we will meet again in the future to continue debating on this topic. So thank you very much for coming here.
Oh, and I should thank the MAPSI group in general and Victoria and Beatrice in particular for inviting us to come. It's been a very enriching experience for us, and both in terms of the conference and learning about what's going on in MAPSI, and of course of finding all the cultural dimensions of Bilbao. So thank you.
You're welcome.